So what is the difference between map and forEach? Today we're going to take a quick look at these two functions and compare and contrast them and talk about when you should prefer to use one over the other. So let's get right into it. So what I've done here is created a new index.html file in VS Code, and what you can do is type in HTML:5, and this will, if you hit tab, it'll fill in all the boilerplate for creating a new HTML file. We will just create a script tag and write all of our JavaScript in here. And the first thing we'll do is create an array of people. And this will just be an array of strings. So we'll put some names in here that we're going to use for comparing the forEach and the map functions. So we have 4 names in our list, and the purpose of the forEach function is to run to do something for every single element in the array. So in our first example, what we want to do is just print out the person's name. So we can do people.forEach with a capital E, and this is a function that we pass in a function to. This function that we pass in is going to get run once for every single element inside of our array. So the first parameter to this function is the current element that it's on. So here we'll just name it person, and what we'll do is console.log out the person's name. So we'll say person and pass in the person there. So just like this. So for every person inside of our people array, we are going to run this function here, and this function, all it does is just console log out the person's name. So what you can do in VS Code is right click on the file name and click copy path. Then if you open up your browser, you can paste in that path to the URL and hit enter, and it will open up your page. So our page is just white, but if you right click and click inspect and open up the console, you can see our code ran here. So we see person, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there's also a second argument to the forEach callback function. So we have just referenced person. You can also have the second argument, which is the current index. And this has to do with which spot this person is inside of the array. So Matthew would be at spot 0, Mark would be at spot or index 1, Luke would be at index 2. So we can do here, we have person, we can say is at index, and then we'll pass in our index here and save this. Go back to the browser and hit refresh. We see we now have the spot for each element or person in our array. And a common use case that people do that isn't necessarily bad practice, but it's not the best, is they'll use forEach to create a new array. So we'll create a new array called people. We already have this one as people. So if you right click on this, you can rename it, and we'll just have this be names. And then this right here, we'll rename it as well to be name. And we're going to create a new array called people. So people will be a more complex array in that instead of just having strings, we're going to create an object for each name. And the object will have a first name property and also an ID, which we'll just set that to be the index. So inside of here, we can do people.push to add an element to our array, and we're going to add an object here where the first name is going to be equal to the name, and then the ID will be equal to the index. and we will console log this out as well, so that we can see what our people array looks like. So we can save this, refresh it here. We have an array with 4 elements. And you see each of them has a first name and an ID. And it turns out that this is actually such a common practice that most programming languages, JavaScript included, have a dedicated function for creating creating a different array from an existing one. And that is where the map function comes in. So we could achieve this same functionality with using the map function. So we'll create an array called people2, and this is going to be equal to names.map. And map takes a function very similar to forEach, where the first parameter is the name or the current element, and the second parameter is the index, which index that element is located at inside the array. And this function, you actually are supposed to return something. So you see inside of this function, we never returned anything because forEach doesn't expect anything. For this one, we are supposed to return what the new object should be in our new array. Or it doesn't even necessarily have to be an object. It could still be a string or a number or anything. But for our use case, we're using an object. So here we can say return first name is equal to name, and the ID is equal to index. And we'll console log this out as well. And you can see that this here achieves the same thing as creating an array and then adding to it inside of the forEach. So go to the browser, refresh this. So here's the first one that we built with the forEach, and here's the second one that we built with the map. So using forEach to build an array like this is not necessarily bad practice, but using map is the best practice for doing so. So forEach is useful for when you want to just go through a list and do something like console.log it, or maybe if you have a list of DOM elements, you might want to change all of them. So we can actually do that quickly here. If we go into our body tag, outside of the script tag, we'll create an unordered list. It's the UL element. And we'll create 5 LI elements in there. And what we put in here isn't too important. 4, 5. There we go. So we have just these bullet points here, and we'll close this out. So you can see we have these LIs, and if you wanted to go through and modify each one, using forEach would be a good solution for that. So you would first have to get a handle on them, so you can say, put it to a variable that we will call LIs, and we will select all the LIs on the page. And then in this case, query selector all, it doesn't actually return an array, it returns a node list, but it's very similar to an array in that it at least has the forEach method. So you can do lis.forEach, and then we pass in a function here. So for every li, run this function, and what we'll do is just say li.style.color is equal to red. If we save this, we come here, we see it's originally black. We refresh it, and we see the forEach modified each one. So when you want to just do something for each element and you don't care about the output or turning it into anything else, using forEach is the best method. When you want to run change the original element and create a new array with something different, using map is the best choice in that case. So we started with this simple just string here, and we created a more interesting object here where we have a first name and an ID. So I hope these examples have cleared up for you a little bit when you should prefer to use forEach and when you should use map. And in this series, I'm actually going to show you a variety of different use cases for when you can use forEach or other array methods such as filter or sum or every. And for the most part, you can actually get away from ever using forEach. There's more specific dedicated functions for a lot of the use cases you might have, but at the same time, forEach can be very intuitive and quick for people who aren't as familiar with the other array methods.